By the time you watch this video, Lords of the Fallen will likely have released. We'll be able to play it, we'll be able to judge it for ourselves, see if it's any good. In the meantime though, the reviews have released, and I think it'd be fair to say that they've been a mixed bag. However, I don't know if that is always fair, because there always seems to be this trend where a AAA game will come out, it's really middling, it's by the numbers. I think of something like an Assassin's Creed Mirage, I think of a Far Cry, I keep thinking of Ubisoft as examples, which I probably shouldn't. It's unfair just to pick on them, but it does seem to be the trend that you'll get a AAA game, it'll be average, and it will get 7s out of 10s, it'll get 8 out of 10s. But when the same thing happens to a smaller publisher's game, it comes out, maybe it's a bit rough around the edges, you suddenly start to see 4 out of 10s, 5 out of 10s, and the difference in something like a Metacritic score ends up being massive. The middling game, that'll end up at an 80 or a low 80s, whereas the smaller publisher game, like a Lords of the Fallen, ends up stuck in the 60s, maybe the 70s if it's lucky. So that to me is a little bit concerning. I'll say I do not care about Metacritic scores. I don't think you can judge them. When I was super young, I probably did care about it. I'd get, super hyped because the latest Nintendo game has got a 97 or something. But it's just par for the course now. It doesn't really matter what the game is and what the quality is. It sometimes seems predetermined what the Metacritic score is going to be. So I don't think it's anything anyone should really care about. For me personally, I'll go off something like Steam reviews, where it's genuine users, they've played the game, and you normally get a pretty well-rounded idea of if it's at least worth playing or not, if it's totally garbage. So with Lords of the Fallen, there have been some really good scores. I think I saw IGN France gave it a 10 out of 10. I don't know if the French are just generous with game reviews or if it really was that good to them, but there are examples of 10 out of 10s, 9 out of 10s. There are also some very low scores, and an example would be GameSpot's review, and GameSpot, they gave it a 5 out of 10. The reviewer, Phil Hornshaw, he's released a number of games. I think it is important to mention the reviewer because all that we see on these mainstream sites like Metacritic is GameSpot gave it at a 5, but it's not as if every reviewer there sat down with the game, they had a big round table meeting, they had a chat amongst each other, they got the slide decks out, the meeting minutes, and at the end of all that it was 5 out of 10. No, it's one person who works there playing the game and giving their opinion. They're obviously allowed to have their opinion on the game, but where I think it's misleading is it sort of goes up there as if the whole site has given it this review score, and that's what we sort of have to live by, that's what we've got to go by. However, it doesn't really factor in, is this the sort of game that Phil enjoys? Because a 5 out of 10, that is really low. I scoured through some of his other reviews to find similar scores. What else does he think is as bad as Lords of the Fallen? And there were games, like I mentioned the Far Cry example of Far Cry 6, I think got a 7 out of 10, and I don't know anyone who liked that game. Again, the Steam reviews, not very good for it. Mixed online, it just seems to be pretty average. I also found Marvel's Avengers, that Square Enix game, that got a 7 out of 10 from Phil. So clearly he thinks that game is better than Lords of the Fallen. He thinks a lot of games, pretty much every game I saw is better than Lords of the Fallen. He really hates this game. Again, he's entitled to his opinion, that's fine, but I honestly think that if you sat down with him, he probably wouldn't think that Lords of the Fallen is the worst game that he's ever reviewed. Again, it comes back to this difference between smaller publishers and the larger AAA publishers and studios. I do not think any of these mainstream reviewers have the balls to give a big title a lower score, and to be fair to them, they're probably not allowed. There are examples of where if a reviewer goes drastically against the grain, gives a title a 2 out of 10 where everyone else is giving it an 8. Was it Kane and Lynch? There's some example out there like that. The reviewer can actually lose their job. So is it worth it to them to maintain that integrity around the scores and risk losing their livelihood? Probably not. I can understand it. But still, something's probably got to be done, or at least audiences have to shift away from caring about the mainstream consensus. Because Lords of the Fallen, from everything I've seen and read, I don't think it's a 5 out of 10 in the same way a GameSpot review would normally score something like that. AAA titles, they never get below a 7. It always seems like if it's AAA, 7 is pretty much the lowest. A 6 out of 10, that means it is unplayable. It's a joke. It's a borderline scam. That is a 6 in the AAA space. But when it's indie, if it's AA, smaller sort of publisher, then it's the full 1 to 10 scale. That isn't fair because people in the mainstream, and this is why I care about it. So again, I don't care about Metacritic, but it is a problem because hardcore gamers, if we want to call people that, who go online and look into things properly, they aren't going to care about the Metacritic scores. They'll look into it properly and probably buy a game if it lines up with what they're looking for, if they like it. But the 90% of people who actually buy these titles, they're the ones who fund studios' new games. If only the smaller 10%, small minority people living on the internet, if they're the only ones who bought games, the industry probably wouldn't be sustainable as it is right now. So you need that 90%, the people who are going to go off word of mouth or quick Google search, is Lords of the Fallen good? That sort of thing. Those people are going to be heavily influenced with what's going on in the mainstream. What are the mainstream reviewers' sites saying about a title? So what they're going to see is Lords of the Fallen getting a 5 out of 10 from GameSpot, and they're going to remember that the worst game ever, some AAA title that was literally the worst thing ever, got a 6 out of 10. So now Lords of the Fallen looks like an absolutely atrocious game, when really I think GameSpot are just saying, hey, it's average in some areas. They're not really saying it's the worst thing of all time. But their hands seem to be tied. They don't give big titles 5 out of 10s. They just don't do it. So it really just stuffs up the weighting. It stuffs up the statistics, I guess, if you were going to compare different titles across the year and what scores they got. It's not fair on Lords of the Fallen. I'll say again, the person is entitled to their opinion, but you get the sense from their review that this game may not be for them. This has happened before. Alien Isolation. I did check, I don't think that this person reviewed that game, thankfully. But Alien Isolation, it got a very good reception from most people, but a few of the mainstream publishers, they gave it a bad score, and you got the sense in that situation that the reviewers maybe just didn't like the game. They might not have liked survival horror. And that caused some problems. Alien Isolation sold poorer than expected. They didn't make a sequel. It doesn't seem like they're going to make a similar game with the Alien IP. And that is going to affect us getting high-quality single-player games that actually take risks. They risk being bad to be great, to try things that games don't always do, to not be just more of the same. To get those sort of titles, they almost have to risk being bad in some ways. And that often turns off mainstream reviewers who just seem happy and content with by-the-numbers titles. They'll give it 8 for something middling, but they'll give a 4, they'll give a 5, that's something that takes risks, if they're not sort of getting paid or influenced in the background. And what I mean by that is advertisers paying a site like IGN or GameSpot, and that means there's a bit of influence there. It's not really good. If I think of, say, Nintendo games, if the average person goes online and looks up Zelda, they're going to see, for pretty much any entry, 96s, 97s, 98s. This average person isn't really going to understand that Nintendo games just always seem to get those scores. To be honest, it doesn't really matter the quality. Yes, I love their games. I love the Zelda series. It's really good. But I do question sometimes a Zelda title getting a 98 and then another title getting, say, a 90 and thinking, that 90 game, that was at least as good as the Zelda one, but it seems like there's some internal politics or something. Often the reviewers don't want to give worse scores to some of those Nintendo series. It's just something in the background that the average person isn't going to know or understand, that there's a bit of influence at play. I'm not talking about all these game developers, publishers, they're paying off the reviewers. It's not really that. It's more of a culture thing. I think most people will understand what I'm talking about. But it does affect game sales, and I don't like to see it. The main problem is with these smaller developers, because Lords of the Fallen, it looks good, and I haven't played it. I might play it and agree with this GameSpot reviewer. I might decide, you know what, it is a 5 out of 10. I was wrong in this instance. That's fine, but this has been a problem for a while. What I do want to address, because some people may say there's holes in your argument, there's a lot of indie games that do get very, very positive reviews from both the public, but also from the mainstream reviewers. However, it always seems to be a certain type of indie game. It is always well polished. it's often not super complex because it is being made by a smaller team, and that is only possible often if they do make a smaller scale title. It might be 2D, it may be 3D, but something like a walking simulator where it's not overly complex. And it's great that those games do get good reviews, and that those indie studios are able to develop, keep producing more high quality titles. However, it seems like any time a smaller studio tries to make a 3D game that's in line with the AAA titles that are out there, they immediately get shat on. And I don't know if it's because the mainstream publishers don't like the idea of an indie studio, a smaller studio, sort of coming on their turf, walking on their turf, and maybe taking ground, taking sales away from their sorts of titles. Could that be it? I'm, again, not saying that the reviewers are necessarily being influenced in that way and being paid to shit on these games. Certainly not. There's just no incentive there for the mainstream reviewers to look favourably on games that are trying to have a go of it. They shouldn't get good scores just for trying, but I also think if they are taking risks and they are producing something that is single player, it doesn't have microtransactions, there's no scumminess, that they do deserve that fair shot. IGN, they put out a review that was heavily praised, talking about Baldur's Gate 3 taking chances and producing a game that was actually for gamers. It wasn't scummy. They went out and did that, and game developers out there from the AAA studios, they didn't like it. So IGN should put their money where their mouth is. I think they might have actually given Lords of the Fallen a fairly reasonable score, but GameSpot certainly haven't. So this is happening, and I hope it can change. I hope this perception can change, that gamers can look beyond that Metacritic, that shiny green number, not getting scared off, just looking at the game on its merits, going online and seeing, hey, how does this game actually compare to other titles that I enjoy? Not just across the board, how is it? Does a mainstream reviewer who doesn't touch anything that's not a Sony first-party exclusive, forget about what they think. Think about what people who actually like your genre enjoy, and does it line up with that? Is it quality in that aspect? I also think that sometimes monetization should actually play a part in the review scores. I know it won't ever happen. However, if a game releases and there's no early access, there are no store cash items, those sorts of things, maybe they should have a say. We have, of course, seen examples where studios implement the shadiness later, so maybe that won't quite work, but you could always update a review if that gets included, and that could always deter studios from doing it if they know, hey, if I start putting cash stores in, like Dying Light 2, maybe my reviews are going to go down, and it will mean I'll struggle to get new sales because people look it up and suddenly the game doesn't look very good. That's all, well, totally a pipe dream, let's be honest, but in an ideal world that could happen. I'll just say this, Lords of the Fallen, it may be very good, it may not be so good. All we've got to go off right now are some videos and the reviews, but I do hope that people who hold off from buying it, they don't close the door. They do look at the word of mouth, they see what the general public is saying, and perhaps if people are looking for a Souls-like experience, perhaps it does tick the boxes. Because from what I'm reading, if I give it a fair analysis, it seems like it does a pretty good job. It may just be a bit janky, it might have some balancing issues with bosses, maybe there's a bit of HP bloat at times with the enemies, but I certainly don't think it deserves a 5 out of 10 from what I'm seeing in comparison to other titles, like Marvel's Avengers getting a 7. The latest Far Cry getting a 7. I don't believe that Lords of the Fallen can be more middling than that. But thanks so much for listening. I'll see you on the next one. Cheers. Bye.